if 10 new ones come on the scene, I think 8 of them will be way too rational in their positioning, meaning they will misunderstand that the reason people are buying this is because of the functional benefits, the digestive benefits, the calorie counts, etc. I think the minority of them will recognize that maybe I'm spilling all the tea with this report, and I'll make my everyone
To
that
my
loves
listeners, don't listen to this next part.
exactly. I'm going to ruin my own prognostication.
Hunter Thurman is CEO of Alpha Diver, and Hunter and his team have been colleagues and supporters and suppliers of content that we've been publishing here at the Customer for the past few years. It's always insightful. And maybe more than that, it's always just really, really interesting, the approach that you guys take. But Hunter and I have had a handful of these conversations. This topic today is centered around their most recent report, which is called the Bev 50, which looks at the top 50 beverage brands in the US, what's happening and why there as it relates to consumer insights and trends. So that's an overview that I would be better off leaving in your hands. But Hunter, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, always great to be here. Thank you, Mike.
So just for context, maybe give us a little introduction as to what Alpha Diver is and does, and then we can dive right into this report.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are an insights and strategy firm. So for the past roughly 14 years, we've been using psychology to understand why people do what they do. And at the core of what we do is create and maintain this database that we call the Psych Pulse. Basically, we're able to measure consumer psychology at large scale, at the population scale. And that's what fuels this database that shows us trends over time. It explains why people are engaging with the marketplace and certain categories and certain brands and the way they are. And I think maybe most importantly, it predicts what's coming down the pike. It gives us some foresight on where consumer taste and sentiment are headed. And so, of course, we use this database on a daily basis. And over the past few years, we've started generating these reports. The Bev 50 we'll talk about today. Earlier this year, we talked about the Snack 50. We do the Quick 50, which is QSR, and we do the Tipsy 50, which is beverage alcohol. So those are the spaces where we draw from the database, but we're able to draw across a number of categories. Categories like beverage are so interesting because they're so discretionary. Consumer behavior and consumer choice can be so fickle and so elusive. I find this a very interesting topic to aim this data and aim this understanding at.
So you've been doing this for a couple of years. You're starting to gain, a decent longitudinal view of how people are changing. Year to year and over a longer period of time, which is, as we said before we hit the record button, but instructive. But I thought I'd just cherry pick a couple of these statistics and have you talk us through, because some of them on the surface are kind of like, yeah, I kind of expected that. What's news about that one? But then you peel back the layers a couple of levels, and it becomes pretty eye-opening. So let's just start with, let's see, I think number one was that impulse as one of the primary psychological drivers is still the dominant factor in making purchase decisions in the beverage category. Yeah. Am I correct there?
Yeah. So you mentioned, we've been at it a few years. We're fortunate that our database precedes or predates COVID. So essentially what we've done is we've looked at 2018 and 2019 as kind of a baseline. And then a lot of our work over the past several years has been 2020, since, or tracking every quarter since. And what you find in psychology is that there are these really predictable drivers of behavior. People may be rational, which is often what we think. We think we make rational, informed, comparative decisions, but more often than not, there are these other three. One is around social endorsement. What do people like me choose? Another is around discovery, discovering and exploring. And then the fourth one, the one you mentioned, we call impulse. And it's not necessarily impulse buys in the most conventional sense. It's really more about what will make me feel or look good in the immediate term. So it does certainly correlate with something that would be an impulse buy. But what we've seen is that since, call it COVID, so really kind of 2022 to present, this drive of just do what feels good in the moment continues to grow. It's not to say that it's the only decision factor people use, but all of the pressure that has been put on us, we consumers, we people over the past, many years, is creating this almost like this kind of YOLO mindset of, look, I don't know what's around the corner. I don't know what's coming tomorrow. I'm just going to do what feels good. And categories like salty snacks, like QSR, like beverage have now, if you look at 21 and 22 and 23, had some pretty epic success on the back of that. As you pointed out, now pricing pressure, in the first half of this year is creating some kind of blips. But by and large, consumers have been having this very emotional response to, all the goings on of the past few years, and reaching for a drink or a snack that just feels good right now is very core to human behavior, and we see it a lot in our data.
Can you compare that to the pre-COVID years as to what that looked like? I'm thinking of that, I'm sure wrongly, but let's call those the normal years.
Yeah, exactly. Like back in the olden days,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So when all this started and everyone started pondering, like, well, COVID, what's going to happen? How's this? Remember when everybody was talking about the new normal and it was like the big cliche?
Right. Right.
I was a major skeptic because my point of view was there are always stressors, so like I remember being a kid in the 80s and we would do like Soviet bomb drills where we got under our desk at the elementary school. Like when the Soviets attacked, we would get under our desk. That was our line of defense from the atomic bomb. So the point is that was stressful. I mean, if you were alive, during the Vietnam War, that was stressful. If you were, during World War II, World War I, mean, if you were alive in the Great Depression, it's like there's always, and I'm talking kind of US history here, there's always pressures and stressors. My point of view in like 20 and 21 was this is, our current iteration of stressors, and it's going to remain the same. And there are these cycles that we see that predate COVID. What's happened since, and I'm now a believer in as I look at the data, and I think that social media, it has been a big catalyst of it. People really have had an outsized response in the past few years, and we haven't been tracking data since before 2018, but when we look at what's going on now compared to then, people are having a much more emotional response to it. There's this line, if you picture a graph and you see in our report, there's this line that represents this impulse, this do what feels good. It's continued to grow. We've had to stretch the scale with every sequential report because it continues to increase. So the last few years compared to, the normal times, as you put it, they have had a tangible and real impact on people in an emotional way. And even things like pricing. I mean, all this discussion around pricing and inflationary pricing, it's being talked about so kind of black and white, spending power, dollars in versus dollars out. Yes, that's true. But the reaction people are having is far more emotional. And even in the Bev 50, and I think we're going to talk about some of it, there's a very irrational response that people have. And we're seeing that sort of irrationality continue to be a big factor in consumer behavior.
Well, we'll see some of the brands that are actually leveraging that disparity. And but it'll beg the question, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but of these other ones, why aren't they seeing that as an opportunity? Because there certainly is one, with those kinds of gaps out there.
Yeah.
The other thing that's worth talking about here is, well, a lot of it, frankly, but how these brand rankings have shifted, because they have pretty significantly. And I don't know if we're going to have time in this conversation to go through it, but when you're talking about some of the drivers for instance, this impulse factor, why is that? Because those whatever those factors are probably translate beyond just the beverage world, and you could probably find uh, analogs over in the snack world, or maybe even in the tipsy world, as you call
Oh,
it.
for sure.
So
Yeah.
um, that's probably another conversation.
Yeah, I mean, what you find is that in general, the brands that, are positioned and are activating and doing their marketing in a way that aligns with the predominant macro force, those are doing better. So, I mean, we looked at 2 years of sales data, 2 years of household penetration, and 2 years of just sales volume, and the brand in beverage, in fact, and the brands that consumers think will help me feel good now. So you could argue that everything in the report is, quote, an impulse buy. It's a
Right.
bottle of liquid that you can consume that has some benefit or some, whatever that is. So that's kind of a level playing field. From a consumer perception standpoint, however, the ones that people think, oh, this will do the job I'm looking for, this will help me feel good or look good in the immediate term, those brands grew in both penetration and volume over a 2 year longitudinal period. And the brands that they thought aligned with something else, like this helps me bond with my family, or this gives me, some new experience, those either stagnated or declined. So, I mean, the results are real. That these macro forces, we sometimes call it the zeitgeist, the prevailing kind of emotional weather, they're very real in driving preference. And in something, as we said a minute ago, that's so fickle as beverage, it provides a really nice foundation by which to understand what's actually going on.
Picture your organization as a solitary island amidst a vast, churning sea of opportunities. On the horizon lie other islands, relationships waiting to be built, partnerships waiting to be formed. But between your island and those distant shores stretches a turbulent expanse filled with uncertainty and risk. You're going to need a bridge, or bridges, plural, to span this divide, connecting you to new horizons. Those bridges are strategic partnerships. Yet, building bridges and partnerships is no simple task. They both require careful planning, precise engineering, and a deep understanding of the terrain. Missteps can lead to collapse, leaving your business stranded on its island. Tectonic builds strategic partnerships, helping organizations navigate the treacherous waters, ensuring that those bridges are strong and resilient and scalable. There's a reason why some of the largest, most progressive companies in the world are retooling their revenue models and investing in partnerships. Find out more at tectonic.co. That's TECTONIQ.co. Can we talk about a couple of those brands specifically that seem to be benefiting from that kind of thinking, feeling disparity, that perception and disparity? And I'm thinking of Olipop and Poppy
Yeah.
versus more traditional brands like Coca-Cola and Pepsi,
Yeah.
and how you have mapped pricing versus perception of value of price.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So Olipop and Poppy have had this meteoric growth. It's just in the past year, like 1,000% growth, depending on what metric you use, but just like meteoric growth. And what's interesting is everybody said, oh, well, carbonated soft drinks like Coke and Pepsi have been, declining for the last 30 years steadily. These are healthier alternatives that are replacing them. But what we see in the data is that the reason people are choosing, particularly Poppy, which edges out Olipop a little bit in our metrics, but the both of them, the reason why people are choosing it is not rational. It's not, oh, this has only 54 calories and this has prebiotics and this promotes gut health. It's actually totally experiential. It's like what will this feel like? How will this make me feel? What experience will this provide to me? And as I said, particularly if you look at Poppy, I mean, they're all in on, I was looking at an image of their cream soda, and it shows this big, beautiful cream soda with foam kind of dripping down and lens flares kind of flashing off the can. It's all about the experience. That's really what's driving so much interest in those brands. And what we see when we kind of array the data is that the brands that people think are most associated with that really sensory, either that impulse of like feels good now, or that experience, exploration, discover a new sensory experience. Those brands average in our report 13 cents an ounce. So at Walmart with roughly like pack sizes, those are roughly 13 cents an ounce.
And just for reference, that would be the higher end of the scale.
For sure. Yeah. Because brands like Coke and Pepsi and Sprite, the big established brands that are much more mature, they're 8 cents an ounce. So they're 61% less. Okay. Like kind of quote, normal soft drinks are 61% yet less. And yet consumers are more concerned about the price of those than they are Olipop and Poppy, the 13 cents an ounce. So just to step back, I talked about that irrationality. The brands that people think are giving them this really cool sensory experience are more expensive. I mean, Olipop and Poppy are like $3.49, $3.79 a can. A Coke is 80 cents a can. So surely everybody's freaking about the price of Olipop, right? No, they're not concerned about the price because the benefit, the value that they attribute to it, they perceive as kind of worth it. The brands like Coke that you drink every day and consume on a weekly basis, for those that consume it, they're very routinized. They're part of everyday life. Those brands are experiencing much more price pressure. So even though they're 61% cheaper, they're under more price pressure. And it just really demonstrates that kind of irrationality that I mentioned, that I think a lot of manufacturers outside of beverage as well, you talked about snacks and fast food and everything, they're going to get in trouble with it because, if you're running Coke and you start just dropping the price, it's not going to help. It's not, what are you going to be 75% less than Olipop?
Right. At some point you hit the floor.
Math. Yeah, that's not the perceptual math that consumers are doing.
So I would love to talk about this a little bit further. There's my words, not yours, but Coke and Pepsi appear to have been commoditized in terms of price. You kind of know what you're getting, roughly what it costs. That's always going to be the case with those deeply established brands. Do you see with newer products that come into this category that there's a bump and that disparity exists between price and perceived value just because they're new and they're not commoditized? Or is there something different that Poppy and Olipop are doing to kind of achieve that or just take advantage of that disparity?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I totally take your point about commoditization. I think what we see is, rather than commoditization, I'd call it routinization. And so what you find, I mean, it's sort of like if you drive your car to work, if you commute to work every day, you really know the price of gas. If you drive, your kid's soccer game on the weekends and that's it, you're like, I don't know, I guess it's more expensive. It doesn't hurt as much. Right. So what you find is those brands, it's not so much that they're commoditized or that people are bored with Coke and Pepsi. It's that it's much more routinized. There's much more, we talk about these concepts of interest and action. There's very high action. People consume them a lot. They're part of everyday life. They're much more adopted, and routine. And that then leads to, when it's something that's more frequent and more sort of common, kind of along the lines of what you're talking about, you notice it. We've got much more data as humans about what a Coke should cost. It's been around forever. So I think commoditization sort of oversimplifies it, but yes, they're in a different boat than Olipop and Poppy. Poppy comes out. I remember the first one I bought. I was in a convenience store here in Cincinnati called UDF, and I'd been hearing about it, and I saw it, and I grabbed it and went to pay. And the guy's like, 389. I was like, I almost put it back. I mean, it was like, what?
Right.
One can is I mean, literally it was the closest I've come. If it weren't for the shame of it, I would have been like, I don't want to try this that bad. But when I tried it, it was all about, I wasn't like, oh, how many grams of inulin fiber does this have? What, read the label. It was like, ooh, what's this going to be like? What's the sensory experience going to be like? And when you're in that mode, it's totally different. Like that experience for me was worth 389.
So at some point you crossed the emotional threshold, if you will, from being like, I'm gonna put this back here and at the risk of looking like a chump versus like paying for it and then having some expectation that this would be a really worthwhile experience. So, which begs the question, was it a worthwhile experience?
It absolutely. So I had very high interest in it. My interest in it got me over that price hump. It was a worthwhile experience in that I had the experience. I haven't been back. I have not
Right.
routinized. I have not moved into more action for Olipop and Poppy. Perhaps because, I had such sort of a high bar of like, what's this going to be like? And it was like, a reasonably enjoyable beverage experience. It did not move me down towards that action, that routinization space. So, for brands like that, and we see a whole bevy of them, I mentioned, they're the ones that people are not worried so much about the price. They're very interested. There's this whole cluster of them that people are very interested in. It's a tough spot to get out of. We
Yeah.
see in beverage, we do all these reports, and the Bev 50 report is the only one where we have roughly a quarter of the list that's rotational. I mean, the snack 50, the QSR 50, it's very hard to get on or off the list. It's rare, that a brand comes or goes. Beverage, like every year, there's 10 or 12 new ones that are, next year there'll be 10 or 12 new Olipop and Poppy competitors that'll come on the scene. Most will be gone again for 2026. And so I wouldn't say it's easy to get up in that space, but brands like Prime can catapult up into that high interest space where everybody's trying them. And sure, okay, I'll try it once for 389. But to get into that routine where Coke and Pepsi and the like are, it's really difficult.
Right. Do you expect that next year's entrance into this category, the new Olipops and Poppies, will experience that same kind of price value gap that
Yeah, I
these
mean,
did?
so come on the scene. I think 8 of them will be way too rational in their positioning, meaning they will misunderstand that the reason people are buying this is because of the functional benefits, the digestive benefits, the calorie counts, et cetera. I think the minority of them will recognize, and maybe I'm spilling all the tea with this report, and I'll make my, everyone
To
that
my
listens
listeners, don't listen to this next part.
exactly. I'm going to ruin my own prognostication, but I think the ones that succeed will be the ones that recognize that it's really all about, this sensory experience. Then with that, when you're in that really high interest, the way you get someone to drink another poppy, like if using me as an example, the way you get me to drink that second poppy or Olipop is a very different set of marketing activities than trying to get me to drink one more Coke in a given week. It's interesting. I mean, they're both potentially literal competitors, and a lot has been made in the press about is Olipop eating into Coke and Pepsi, et cetera. But the math I'm doing, the decision criteria couldn't be more different. I mean, they're like totally different sets of considerations I'm making. And so again, the brands that manage to get past that high interest kind of initial experience phase will be the ones that activate and go to market in a better way and understand that what got you there, what got you started, won't get you to that kind of promised land, as we call it, of more routinization.
And it's an entirely different psychology behind deciding to make that to become a frequent purchaser of to bond yourself with a brand that's new and more expensive.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And there's all sorts of psychological principles. Our principal, our director of research, Siggy Hale, who's a PhD neuroscientist, he calls it loyalty conditioning. he's like, those brands get up there, Poppy and et cetera, and you can get trial, but loyalty conditioning is a very different set. It's a very, different consideration that people make. And that's not something Coke should be worrying about. It's something that Olipop should be worrying about.
Interesting. It'd be fun to unpack that in your next Tipsy 50 report, because so many of those brands, well, I'm guessing here,
Yeah.
they probably shift a lot more quickly than some of these CPG snack and bigger beverage brands. So there's a
Yeah.
lot in there that people are probably trying and deciding whether or not to bond with them, if they even can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's a lot of similar dynamics in the Bev Alc space for sure.
Can we talk a little bit about, without getting too deeply into weeds, and both you and I like getting deeply into weeds, so we'll work this out here somehow. But you've got a table here that lists a handful of brands ranked according to price. Let me read off the title. Consumers particularly associate these 20 brands with the price barrier. In the
Mhm.
subhead, brands most associated with a price barrier indices. So, and over on the far left, with a giant bar in the chart, is Frappuccino.
hmm Yeah, yeah. So this is, again, we're not saying what are the most expensive. We're saying what are the ones that when consumers are thinking of buying it, price is the biggest barrier for them. And Frappuccino gets the dubious honor of being Starbucks Frapp is the dubious honor of being number one, followed by Coke, Pepsi, Gatorade, Sprite, some of the tea brands. And that's not to say it's, we covered this. I mean, the average price of these brands is 8 cents an ounce. You go to the next or a following slide, the ones that they're least worried about, and those are brands Poppy, Olipop at the 279 per can that I mentioned, but like Electrolyte is a newer isotonic sports drink. It's very similar to Gatorade profile wise, price wise. It's competing with Gatorade very literally. Gatorade, people are worried about the price. Electrolyte, they're less worried about the price. And it's because Gatorade is out, way out there in that highly routinized,
Yeah.
everyday, daily driver analogy that I use, whereas Electrolyte is newer. And it's enjoying and bit of benefiting from some of that, and my coaching, especially in the snack world, has been, do not look at this pricing as a zero sum because these brands. So just take Electrolyte and Gatorade. I mean, it's already perceived as being less expensive. So one or the other slashing the price really may not drive the
Right.
behavior that they think it will.
Um, to reiterate to folks listening to this podcast, we're going to have a link to all kinds of things in the transcript here. So, and I want to be cognizant that we don't just give everything away, because it's really interesting and really easy to kind of talk through.
Mhm.
But having spoken with Hunter and his team over the past couple of years, this is literally the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more here. So I encourage you to reach out to them. One other thing I wanted to just touch on here was a new category that you're tracking this year, which
Mhm.
I find really interesting, and that is the non-alcoholic beer. I'm not a consumer of these things, but I happen to be aware of a handful of people who are passionate. I can't say they're passionate about non-alcoholic beer, but they're committed
Yeah.
to it. So that's going to be an interesting one to track.
Yeah, the whole NA alcohol free thing has been so interesting. I mean, of course, we're looking at it within the Tipsy 50 and we're looking at like the HD9 and cannabis beverages. And, that's the newest thing. You talked about the fickle nature of Bev Alc. Well, now there's like mushroom beverages and I think it's HD9, the cannabis and all that. I mean, that's a whole other kind of, wild west that's existing in that space. And yeah, the NA beer, there's been some theories and some hypotheses that they're interacting more with like CSDs. Like, if you imagine somebody who's interested in the sober movement or not alcohol free or whatever you want to call it, which is sort of widely discussed and sort of, sensationalized in the media. I mean, if you, depending on what articles you read, it's like, oh, younger consumers, 21 plus don't want to drink alcohol. Well, I'm not sure that's the case, but certainly there's been interest in some of these categories. So if somebody were at an occasion, a party or whatever, and they were going to drink an NA beer, is that a replacement for a Coke or a tea? Iced tea has been growing really dramatically. So we included that in this year's report, just to start to get some of those interactions, and just to understand, like, where does it fit? And I don't know that there's anything, we've not dug super deeply into it. Frankly, some of that pricing thing's been very interesting. The Poppy, why Poppy and Olipop has been interesting. Why Dr. Pepper and Pepsi are having the results they are, we've dug into. There's been a lot around hydration. So that NA beer thing is just sort of, dropped to the backdrop a little bit. They're looking at it initially. There's nothing like, there's no like smoking gun, like, oh, it's,
Right.
Sprite, like it's all its volume is coming from some brand or something. But it is something that I'm interested to look at. And frankly, the Bev Alc and the regular Bev, the non-Bev alc that we look at, it's funny how they've been interacting more and more and more as we've looked at this.
Yeah, that's an interesting statement right there. I mean, side note that if you look at the alcohol industry overall, especially in beers, and a little bit in wines, Athletic Brewing, one of the
Yep.
leading non-alcoholic beer brands, is almost the singular bright spot in the beer world right now.
Yeah.
And I can't say the same as strongly for the wine world, but but low alcohol and non-alcoholic wines and their analogs are
Mhm.
trending nicely too. So that one's going to be an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, it's a whole other topic. Again, it's sort of, it's early stage, so we've not dug as much into it. But when you think about the perceptual benefits and all the things I've been talking about, I think a lot of it has been that kind of experience. Like, what will this be like? What is any beer or wine like? Obviously, it doesn't have the alcohol effects, but it'll be interesting to see the degree to which consumers adopt it and what they're comparing it to.
Right.
What it's replacing, and why they're engaged with it. It's something that we'll probably dig deeper to even within these data as we go into the BevAlc 50.
Well, we'll look forward to that report. Again, I want to encourage everybody who is listening to this. You'll see on the customer, you'll see the episode of this version of Customerland, but you'll also see all the links to the reports, to the synopses, to the highlights. And Hunter and his team have given us permission to post a handful of those tables, so you get a sense of how deeply Alpha Diver really thinks about these things. So with that, Hunter, thanks a million. I really enjoy these conversations. They're always insightful and they're always interesting, and looking forward to the next few.